Good morning, afternoon, evening, good thinkers. Welcome to Good Thinking Live, our Monday show where we allow ourselves just a little bit of time to sneak away from all the time that we are told what to think so we can focus on giving ourselves a little bit of the luxury of improving how to think or how we think. So welcome here. I am so glad you're here. Let me know who you are and where you're from in the chat. Please participate because that's what makes it so fun. So if you're watching live, I'm going to try to bring your comments into the live stream where we are streaming live on LinkedIn and on YouTube. So if you want to subscribe, it's Becky Saltzman. You can subscribe. You can smash that bell notification and get notifications for the live show. If you are watching after the stream, welcome here later, and we will try to respond and interact with your comments, although it's easier to interact in live. We have got Jennifer Fellberg from Portland, Oregon. Welcome, Jennifer Fellberg, first good thinker in the house and a regular good thinker. Welcome here. All right. So today I'm kind of excited because this concept, I call it perverse incentives. I mean, I'm not the one that calls it that. It's considered kind of perverse incentives where you create this incentive to try to drive a particular behavior and it has like a really negative effect on your overall goal. So I'm going to welcome some good thinkers here before we get into Goodhart's law. All right, Stephen, greetings from the only place in the United States without voting representatives in Congress. Stephen is not in Soccer City, USA. Who knows where he is? The only place in the US without voting representatives in Congress. And we have got, we've got Alok here from India. Fantastic. Welcome, Alok. And we have Rajiv from India. We've got different parts. So let's see, Gujarat, India. And we have got a great good thinker from Budapest. So we are getting good thinkers from around the world. Super exciting. All right, let me jump into Goodhart's law. You keep letting me know who you are and where you're from, and we'll bring it in. But I want to jump right into Goodhart's law because Goodhart's law it's not a law like a law of nature, but it was an observation made by a British economist where he said, and it kind of goes like something like this: when a measure or a metrics becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. And I'll give you some examples, and then I bet you anything you're going to know and be able to identify some examples in your own life. But last year, in the UK, kind of during the height of COVID, the British government put out something saying that they were using this, they were going to target 100,000 COVID tests a day. And then, lo and behold, as it was creeping up to their target date of when they were going to be testing 100,000 tests per day, they achieved their goal. Yay! But when people dug deep into that measure and how they achieved this goal, they found out something very different, which was the way that they measured the number of COVID tests that were conducted each day had shifted because the target became the goal, the measure became the goal. So they were initially measuring the number of tests that they would do and register, but eventually they started adding in the number of home testing kits that were actually mailed out. And they brought those numbers into the total number. Now, whether they then, when they were sent back in, whether they double counted those was not part of the data. But this is an example of when the measure becomes the purpose. And we're going to get into all kinds of ways to look out for this. But my question to you is, do you have some kind of measure that you use to make decisions? So for example, some people say, okay, I'm going to get on the scale every day at 9 a.m. and I better have that number once a week, and I better have that number lower than it used to be. So I've done this before, and then I think, okay, I'm not going to drink any water before I get on the scale. And I do all of these things to kind of game the measure, which is defeating the purpose entirely. But do any of you have those, or maybe your boss, or maybe you are the boss, where you have created this measure that has become perverse in terms of incentives? All right, let's say hi to Alan from San Jose. And then, and working from home from Maui for the month. Okay, that's a good decision. Love that. And we have got Omar. Hi, Omar. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Do any of you have something where you could point to, you say, well, there's something that I use as a measure, and if I focused too hard on that measure, then that measure can become a perverse incentive. There's this other concept called reification in psychology. Any of you psychologists in the house? Any of you social scientists in the house? Rather, it's social science. It's when this idea like happiness, which is this concept, and you put some measure of happiness. Like some people say, I want to measure my happiness by how many entries I have in my gratitude journal. That's an example of reification, but these concepts can be interchangeable. All right, Michael, welcome. Toronto in the house. And we have got Biljana from New Jersey. And welcome, 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 good thinkers. All right. Another one was there was this fire department. This is an example that we can think about in a lot of social justice, or not just social justice, but social policy, where we identify something, we identify the measure, and we forget the rippling effects. We forget to think through the systems. So there was one where they wanted to tie funding the fire departments by the number of calls that are made. So they wanted to reward the number of calls that are made to these fire departments, because they wanted to reward those fire departments that did the most work. But this discouraged a lot of the fire prevention activities that were instigated by the fire department. So if you're just rewarding the number of calls that are being responded to, then you end up having a perverse incentive. In this case, it created a disincentive for the fire departments to actually do fire prevention. And that resulted in more fires with more devastating effects. So that's a perfect example of Goodhart's law. Does anyone have an example that comes to mind? Ahmed, welcome from Jeddah. Welcome, welcome. So glad all these good thinkers are here today. All right. So how many of you have heard of the Cobra Effect? This is one of the more common, and I'm going to tell you some really fun examples of Goodhart's effect. But the Cobra Effect is a famous and often cited example when the British, when the British were in control of India, and they were tired and sick and tired of all of these cobras slithering around, biting people to death. So they wanted to create an incentive to reduce the number of cobras that were slithering around biting people. So they put out a bounty on the cobras' heads. And so people were just bringing in, dozens and dozens of slaughtered cobras, which became very profitable if you start thinking about, maybe I could breed cobras and then then I can slaughter them and bring them in. So finally, the gaming of the system, and we'll talk about the different ways that Goodhart's effect is seen, but this is one of them where, the measure is the measure. So you go after the measure without the purpose, the clear purpose being an incentive for the clear purpose. In this case, people started breeding cobras and then slaughtering the cobras and bringing them in. When the British government realized this, what did they do? Well, they stopped the incentive. So then what happened? All the breeders said, there's no incentive to breed these cobras, and let the cobras out, which resulted in more cobras, or at least not fewer cobras than the initial problem that the British government was trying to address. So you see this all the time. Like, let's say, have you ever been on a sales team? How many of you are in sales? Anyone? Any good thinkers in sales? Or you run sales teams, you're a leader, and you try to create an incentive about the number of sales or the number of calls made. But so then the salespeople, they just go out and make the sales. but they're maybe selling to, maybe it's a mismatch. They're just selling to any old customer who will sign up, like membership at a gym or something like that. And the membership at the gym goes way up, but then there's a huge churn of customers because they're not the right fit. You're just signing people up, getting your bonus. So that retention number gets ignored. And that's an example of Goodhart. That's one example of Goodhart's law. Or you're a software engineer and you're rewarded for the number of really tough coding challenges you present, and the number of bugs go up, the bugs in the code go up. So there's all kinds of examples where companies or social policy try to make a measurement, a metrics, and it becomes a perverse incentive. All right, so Jennifer says, that's funny and scary, the cobras. And Jennifer, okay, so perfect. Jennifer is in sales. And unfortunately, there are some of these disincentives that like sales generation. You might try to generate a bunch of sales leads, but they're the wrong leads, but you're reviewed, or your bonus or your income is tied to generating those leads. So these are all examples of Goodhart's effect, the Goodhart's law. You might see in the United States a lot of people holding up maybe defund the police. So if that became a metrics, then you might celebrate a police precinct or police department that defunds the police by 23%, but you might celebrate another police department that defunds the police by 73%. So are you really thinking about, then you try to call the police and have them come because someone broke into your house and no one shows up. So these are examples over and over again of Goodhart's effect. And you can, and Omar says, you can blame on dumb KPI. Exactly. These are perfect example where Omar says it's kind of a dumb key performance indicator. And we'll get into how you can get around it, but it's tricky because you don't want everything to be left to judgment because you can have a lot of biases. And also you can't defend yourself against things that are more mushy kind of judgment decisions. So this becomes a little bit of an issue with defensive decision-making. You can defend yourself against these matrix, and but ultimately you're creating perverse incentives for what you really want. So Alan says Wells Fargo got into trouble for that. Yes, Wells Fargo signed up all these people for accounts, or the people working at Wells Fargo had an incentive to sign up people for accounts. And so people were just signing up bogus people for accounts. Perfect example of Goodhart's effect. All right. So David Mannheim and Scott Garabrandt explained these kind of 4 ways you can think of Goodhart's law in their book, Categorizing Variants of Goodhart's Law. Very academic sounding, but you'll see how this totally applies. And it's kind of fun to see if you can say, I can think of an example of that. So let me know if you can think of an example as we get into these 4 kinds of Goodhart's effect. And then we'll talk about what we can do to combat it. Initially, the real reason, and the reason that this was kind of important, not just in old school management and how we kind of make decisions in our own lives, but also in looking at AI and how we program AI. Do any of you know Nick Bostrom's paperclip thought experiment? How many of you know Nick Bostrom's paperclip experiment with AI? It's kind of a famous thought experiment. Anyone? Nick Bostrom? The paperclip experiment. It goes something like this. Suppose someone programs an artificial intelligence, machine learning, very smart machine learning, artificial intelligence, and they optimize this AI to make paperclips. And the measure, so in this case, the matrix is number of paperclips made. So the AI learns to make paperclips really, really efficiently, and then a little too efficiently. And in this thought experiment, the AI takes over the world, reaching into people's mouths, getting their metal to make paper clips, reaching into their hips where they might have, a metal hip implant or whatever. And essentially, this AI takes over the world because it's the thing upon which it was designed and measured is optimized and super optimized, extremely optimized for these paper clips. How many of you have heard of Nick Bostrom's paperclip experiment? And this is an example of a kind of Goodhart's effect. Goodhart's law effect applies to public policy, company management, any kind of incentive design system, even little incentives that you create in your own life. All right, so ready for the 4? Let me know if any of these ring a bell. This one is a little bit more complex, so it's more maybe statistical, but this is called regressive Goodhart. And this occurs because the measurement that you're using becomes a proxy for the goal, but it's an imperfect measurement. Okay, for example, let's say that you are a hiring manager and you recruit, your job is to recruit, recruit other managers or, whatever. And, the main thing you want to know is, am I recruiting people that the future performance will be successful? They'll be successful at our company. And you look and you find out that there is a particular IQ test that you can use, and it has, that correlates with job performance, future job performance. Let's say it doesn't have a perfect correlation coefficient, but maybe it has like a 0.6, it's good, or 0.7. And so you start optimizing for this intelligence test, and you start hiring more and more people for this intelligence test. And you start to realize, wow, we're getting some really good candidates here. So you kind of dial in how much more you use this test. You say, wow, we kind of thought this was a good measure, but we're getting some good candidates. So we're going to get, maybe even higher IQ test candidates. So you kind of dial it in further. And then you start to see something happens, which is you've optimized for hiring people only with high IQs, but you start to see that some of the higher IQ people, first of all, they're annoying to work with. I mean, this is just hypothetical. And also maybe their job performance isn't as great as some of the people just above the mean on this IQ test. And this is an example of, and then you ignore some of these other things that you were using, these other measures of future job performance, because this becomes such a great measure that you think that this is the measure, like it becomes the stand-in for future job performance, and you ignore all of these other things, and this creates this regression. So that's an example of, that's one example of Goodhart's law. And your measurement just becomes a bad measure. And sometimes you might hear someone refer to this as the tails come apart. So that's this regressive Goodhart. And then there's the extremal Goodhart. Now this occurs when, and there's a great example of this one I like, but this occurs when your measure is a good measure, except for in the extreme. So you might pick a measure because it's correlated with your goal, in normal circumstances, but not in the extreme. So think about the paperclip experiment. You program the AI to make paperclips, and it works. It works until it doesn't work in the extreme. Or for example, like you could take the idea of sugar. Humans evolve to like sugar because, theoretically, sugars were, in more highly caloric things in the olden days in our ancestral environment. And this worked when we were, hunting lions. But now this same kind of body optimization is not great for the way we live today, where we're sitting with a bag of Doritos in front of our video game and drinking sugary drinks, whatever. So this is an example where even our body is optimized for something specific, but in the extreme, it kind of takes over and has a negative effect. All right, so Stephen says, bullseye, exactly, bullseye. Jennifer says, IQ is not a necessary job requirement. In some cases it might be. So it might be a very good measure. You might have, it might be a bad measure. It might, if it doesn't have 100% correlation, or maybe a certain score has a higher measure, but the higher you go in the extreme, it stops being correlated. The point is that the measure cannot become the purpose. And that's really where you need to look out. But these are all great. So how about this? How many of you know, this is the causal Goodhart, and this is kind of the common one where correlation is not causation. And so many of us, including myself, fall prey to this one. For example, you always wanted to be in the C-suite. You want to be a senior executive. You want to be a CEO. And you read this really great article or this study that found that CEOs are more likely, I'm making this up, this isn't necessarily true, but you read this study that says CEOs are more likely to read nonfiction books. So you make it your goal in your march toward the C-suite to read only nonfiction books. That's a very, and we all kind of do some of these little superstitious things, but when you really start making that your measure, so you might even get more specific that on average CEOs read 20 nonfiction books a year. So you make it your goal to read 20 nonfiction books a year, perhaps ignoring other matrix that you could be using to advance yourself toward the C-suite, if that's what you want, for example. So Michael says, let's see, Michael says, common sense and logic can be more important. Yeah, and this isn't really about necessarily what's a better hiring matrix. It really, and we'll get into that, it really is about how to avoid allowing any measure, because common sense, how do you measure common sense and logic? If you create a measurement for that, then you could also be falling prey to that particular measure, because it's hard. What's a measure of common sense and logic? So that's really a good one. And Jennifer says, smarter and more creative people swear. Okay, perfect example. Great example. I did read this where smarter and more creative people swear. So you go around dropping F-bombs thinking, I guess does that make me smarter? That's a perfect example. If you're going to measure your intelligence by the number of swear words, perfect. All right. And the final one, the final kind of Goodhart is the adversarial Goodhart. And that's an example like the Cobra example, where it really becomes a perverse incentive. But there are tons of other examples. There's a famous example in the former Soviet Union where they were trying to create an incentive to create more nails, like metal nails for, industry. And so they put an incentive to create more nails. So nail manufacturers started making these little tiny useless nails that they could just churn out using less and less metal. So then the government, USSR got a little smarter. They said, we're going to do it by weight. We're not going to fall prey to this. We're going to do it by weight. Well, then the nail manufacturers started making these big, huge, useless nails that were really heavy. Now, if that becomes the measure, people will kind of work around it to try to create a way to achieve what they are told is the goal. And it's not unique to humans. So here's a fascinating example. I love dolphins. I think you're going to love this one. There was I don't remember where it was, but it was some aquarium. And I don't know, people were throwing garbage with the dolphins or whatever, but they created an incentive for dolphins. They wanted to see if dolphins could be trained to pick up garbage. So I don't know where the garbage was coming from. I can't remember. I don't know where the garbage was coming from, but they wanted to train dolphins to pick up garbage. So these dolphins they trained, they started seeing, hey, it's working, until some of the wiser dolphins, and these dolphins are very smart, started ripping up pieces of garbage so they could bring in more. I mean, they were rewarded with fish. So they would bring in more pieces of garbage and get more fish. Okay, so you think, how clever. There is adversarial Goodhart right there at the aquarium, but it gets even better. Some of the dolphins actually started hoarding fish. And then letting the fish go and collecting the fish, I mean, it became this whole thing where these dolphins continued to game the system and game the system. And it makes you realize that, it's not just humans being devious or bad humans kind of taking advantage, but when you are rewarded and awarded based on specific measures, people will get clever in finding ways around that measure. In colonial Vietnam, the colonial officials began noticing that they wanted to get rid of rats. So they created an incentive for each rat tail that was brought in. All right, each rat tail that was brought in. All right, so what happened? Who can guess what happened? Who can guess what happened? Well, people brought in a lot of rat tails for a bounty. And then people started noticing, the government started noticing something very mysterious about the rats that were swarming all over the city. Breeding and breeding and breeding. They didn't have tails. So this is another example of, this was like in the early 1900s, this is another example of adversarial Goodhart. So we see this a lot. Now, if you want evidence-based policy, would you be shocked to find business people or politicians or whoever that would find and manipulate evidence to justify a policy? Would that shock you? Yes or no? Would that shock you? No rats. Yes, no rats had tails. Exactly. No rats had tails. No rats had tails. So like all the rats were scampering around without tails. Perfect example of adversarial Goodhart. But would it shock you, yes or no, to find out? For example, if you are advocating to abolish the police or defund the police, is that your measure or your matrix, what you measure? Or are you looking to achieve something else? And this is where the solutions become really important. And we'll get into the solutions in the last few minutes of today's show. All right. First of all, pick your measures carefully. If you are simply sloganifying your measures, so because it works well on a sign or people are getting behind it, or it's pithy or alliterative or it rhymes, beware of the fact that that can become the measure that you aim for, thinking that people understand what you kind of mean, but you're not thinking through the ripple effect of your decision. So pick your measures carefully. Also be open to the unintended consequences by using thought experiments. Just think through and be willing to question prevailing beliefs and wisdom. Think through. So, you pay a painter by the hour, I might be saving money on the bid, but this may become the longest paint job I've ever seen in my life. Or if we optimize, let's just say we optimize, we want to reduce the number of police killings or police people involved in gun exchange. Well, that might be a great measure until you start to call the police and they select where they respond based on the likelihood of being involved in a gun exchange. So there is a lot of dangerous policy that just kind of having this awareness of Goodhart's law will help you prevent. All right. So Michael says, look at any employee survey and the questions used, measured for a high score, employment engagement versus reality. And Jennifer, yeah, exactly. And, I don't want to get into too much about what makes a good employee or not, because the fact of the matter is an awareness of Goodhart's law will lead to the third thing that can kind of prevent, which is using more than one measure. For example, Andy Grove called this using the opposing pair indicator. So if you're going to measure for sales, then you have to countermeasure for retention. And so you have to create these opposing measures, think about them, and then kind of measure against each other. So, but it really comes down to when you see a measure that's working and you get excited about it, not honing and not kind of sharpening in and forgetting that the measure isn't the purpose, and replacing the measure as a proxy for the purpose. So Jennifer says these team experiments, these thought experiments could be great team activity. Yeah, thought experiments are a great team activity as long as you are allowed to ask questions and challenge prevailing beliefs to do the thought experiment. But if someone says, I can't believe you even asked that, we can't even think like that, then you can fall prey to some of these traps. And Ellen says, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Oh my gosh, O.J. Simpson's attorney, great example. Wonder if that's Goodhart's law. Probably someone could come up with even a different law for that. But again, a little pithy comment, and we're going to measure. I could follow along the logic. We're going to decide on OJ's guilt or not guilt based on the measure of whether the glove fits. And that is very enticing, particularly when it rhymes. Excellent. Excellent. Michael says, depends on who is benefiting and deciding on the metrics. Exactly. And that's where it's really good to do these thought experiments. So you think about opposing indicators. And then the last couple of things, there's the last few things before we're going a little long, but I'll wrap up, is you pair a short-term benefit against a long-term cost. Like if your short-term benefit, if you are being rewarded for short-term goals that have a long-term cost, you might not see what's around the corner that these metrics cause, these traps. And then you could also pair a quantitative measurement with a qualitative one. So like you could say, okay, number of sales calls made with paired with the number of deals closed, for example. And so you've got a kind of a quantitative with a somewhat quantitative and qualitative measure. And you can improve your correlations between what you use to measure and the outcome you hope to achieve. If you really, really focus on the outcome, and if you create a good measure for that outcome, but then you kind of go through the thought experiment of where all that could go wrong, even creating preposterous examples, like in the police example, what if the police was defunded all the way down to bare bones, and then you call, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to achieve? A society, and maybe it's a society without police, that could be, but be careful of the unintended consequences of perverse incentives. And finally, beware of jumping to conclusions about cause and effect. This is really the only way to know what outcome you want to achieve. So just be careful that the measure does not become the purpose. All right. Any final thoughts, questions? Let's see. Michael says, thanks for great thoughts and have a great day. Thank you. Thanks, good thinkers. Welcome to tuning in. I will see you next week. And if you're checking us out, joining the Good Thinkers, we're here LinkedIn Live on Mondays, 9 a.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and on YouTube Live at Becky Saltzman. Thanks for being here. I always appreciate the excellent good thinkers. Have a great week.